Hello and welcome to DSA Presents. My guest today is René Rojas, a fellow DSA member and sociologist who teaches at Binghamton University. We did part one of this program recently, in which René talked about the history of policing and what led up to the current situation. Today, we're going to focus more on solutions and where we go from here. But we agreed that the situation that we're dealing with is police who are excessively militarized, have equipment that's not needed for domestic, local situations, and who are particularly oppressive to marginalized groups of all kinds in our communities. So René, do you want to amplify on that?
Yeah. First of all, thanks for inviting me back on to finish this conversation. I think it's imperative, given the gravity of the situation, right? Given the levels of violence perpetrated by police in poor neighborhoods and communities in the U.S., and of course the magnitude of related problems like mass incarceration. It's imperative that we immediately find viable solutions to this problem, solutions that are humane, egalitarian, and are derived democratically. Before we get into that, if it's okay with you, I'd like to just recap, right, accounts of the crisis of police violence and police murder, in fact, and mass incarceration in this country, because we can't really talk about what are the best solutions, what solutions are called for, if we don't really understand what's driving the problem. So just to reiterate very briefly what we discussed last time, right? As I said, one very prominent account right now links, right, the crisis of police violence and murder to white supremacy, and views this as a trans-historical problem. And by that, we mean a problem that's existed over the long course of American history and is still with us today. And violent cops, mass incarceration, are an expression of that. So we went over that last time. What I failed to, I think, adequately articulate was an alternative account. So I just want to say a little more about that right now, right? Whereas the first account, the one that rests on this notion of kind of shape-shifting transhistoric white supremacy, emphasizes continuity. An alternative account would actually look at changes in the U.S. political economy, right, and more recent transformations in the American economy and the American political system, to try to reach an understanding of what's going on here, right? And one, I think, very compelling analysis, right, actually begins in the post-war era in the U.S., particularly, in the 50s and 60s, where, as I said last time, there was the second the last part of the mass migration of African Americans from the South into the North and Midwest and the Western part of the country to industrial centers. They left Jim Crow as Jim Crow was unraveling, and as anyone else would, sought employment opportunities and opportunities for social advance in Northern and Midwestern industrial centers. Of course, when they arrived during this time, the decline of American manufacturing was just setting in, right? The beginning of the crisis, the global crisis that particularly hit American industry beginning in the late 60s and early 70s was happening. And so what you had was a situation in which you had masses of people formerly from the South, right, entering a situation without adequate job opportunities for them. Now, to make matters worse, right, these cities relied on services, right, and safety nets in a society where the safety net is very paltry, it's very spotty, full of gaps, very weak. So there were no public programs. There weren't sufficient public programs, even with the policies of, under Johnson, the Great Society, et cetera. There weren't enough social programs. There wasn't enough social revenue, right? Robust enough social state to address this situation. To make matters even worse, this was because of this problem. This is when you see a phenomenon that is known as white flight, right? White flight more generally was middle class and professional families fleeing urban centers, right? Exactly to escape these budding social problems and escape the possibility of being taxed so that cities could have revenue to address this problem, right? So it's one crisis compounding another, and it sets the stage, right, for concentrated poverty. Very, terrible conditions in urban centers in the most prosperous countries in the prosperous country in the world, right? The wealthiest society in the world. That inevitably led to people having to make a living, right, in the informal economy, people having to make a living in the illegal economy, and finding other ways to get by. And that, of course, was the cause of skyrocketing crime rates beginning in the late 60s and late 70s. This is a fact, and I think as progressives, as radicals, we have to be able to grapple with it, right? And of course, rather than to blame neighborhoods, communities, families, individuals who find themselves having to enter this type of economic activity to get by, right? The indictment is not of the people. The indictment has to be of the system that generates this type of situation. Anyway, in a country like
behavior that people need to get by, criminalizing victimless crimes.
That's right. Whereas these people, these families, communities are the victims themselves, right? But the response, as you said, is to victimize them, to blame them, to go after them with harsh, aggressive, murderous policing, right? And of course, an increasingly harsh penal system and judicial system, which is just throwing people away, locking them up with harsher and harsher sentencing, right? This was the turn toward law and order politics, throw them away and lock them up and throw away the key, that type of policy that became so prominent in the late 70s and 80s, of course, nationally under Reagan, the war on drugs, for instance, right? Now, of course, had the US had a robust social safety net, had the US been in, like other advanced capitalist systems, right, had a strong labor movement with a strong labor party, it might have pushed for policies that were more humane, that invested more in safety nets, right, that could deal with the situation of millions and millions of families not finding adequate work. Instead, what it does is it relies on policing, right? Now, there's a lot said about how so much more money is spent on policing, for instance, relative to education, right? So per capita, there's more spent on policing and incarceration than there is per individual student, right, in inner cities. But the problem with that is that it's somewhat misleading, because in the aggregate, while individually that might be the case, in the aggregate for elites in this country, it's actually a really cheap way of dealing with poverty and the problems that come with poverty, right? Policing and police budgets are obviously too big, right? But compared to the budgets that would be required to actually address the situation, training, right, for unemployed people, housing, adequate housing, dignified housing, right, for poor communities, infrastructure, healthcare, et cetera, right? Actually, policing and carceral budgets are really small. So for elites, it's the best deal possible, right? Rather than addressing the underlying causes, what do? Well, you just attack them viciously with police. And of course, one of the attendant problems with that is that in a society with so much poverty, with so much inequality, and high rates of crime, right, policing ends up being quite brutal, because that's the whole point of brutalizing poor communities, right?
So what you're saying is that it's cheaper and more efficient to repress people than to actually change the conditions of their lives.
Exactly. Now, of course, this is not to say by any means that there aren't severe racial disparities involved in this, or that racism, isn't present in policing, in the carceral system. That's not at all, it's not at all to deny that. In fact, it's a fact. You look at the numbers, police brutality and incarceration disproportionately affects Black men and in general, poor men of color. And of course, racist attitudes and racist behaviors no doubt pervade the policing that happens in urban centers. Rather, the point is not, it's not to deny that there's a racial dimension to this or a racialized dimension to this. The point is that if we're going to seek viable and lasting solutions, right, we can't just focus on the racism involved, on the racial disparities involved. We have to go further and deeper and address the underlying causes, right? That's the only way we're going to, in my view, get rid of these racial inequalities, these racial disparities that shouldn't exist in any dignified, right, any egalitarian and democratic society. But the point is to address them and to eliminate those disparities, right? You have to look beyond just the racism in these institutions and tackle the underlying root causes.
So what are some of the options? At this point, the anger is focused on the police, and policing, and prisons, and I think people see that as a target, a focus, rather than the kind of global change that you're talking about.
Yeah, and I don't think that's a bad thing necessarily, right? As a first step to point the finger at the very institutions that poor communities have to confront on a daily basis, right? And is good because it kind of sheds a light on the tip of the iceberg for sure, but the iceberg as well, right? Once you get to past the most immediate problem, you can dig deeper and start addressing, right, these root causes. So I guess it's worth, saying some words, discussing some of the measures, some of the reforms that have come up. Obviously, because policing and murderous policing is at the center of what's going on, one of the solutions that is posed that we're hearing a lot about is abolition, right? Just about abolish the police altogether. Now, of course, if police are merely a manifestation of white power and white supremacy aimed to suppress people of color, then it stands to reason you should abolish them, right? Of course. The problem is, that might not be all that's going on. Again, policing, aggressive, even brutal, murderous policing, right, in a way is being shaped by these underlying social problems. And so the problem with abolition, in my view, is that you could get rid of the symptom, but you're not going to get rid of the deeper underlying problems. And in fact, all surveys that poll residents of poor neighborhoods where there are high crime rates, right, they all end up showing that folks who are most affected by police brutality are not, in fact, for abolition. And it's rational. It's because they perfectly understand, right, that abolishing the police in these circumstances actually make these communities even more vulnerable, will actually, I think, aggravate the poor quality of life in these neighborhoods. We can't, as I said earlier, we can't just turn a blind eye as radicals, as progressives to, crime, because one of the things that radicals have always fought for was to eliminate violence and crime in the lives of poor working class communities, right? Because it's an affront to our quality of life. If you look at cities like Memphis, St. Louis, Detroit, right, even Chicago, but these cities are in fact do worse than Chicago. The homicide rates are a very real problem. They end up looking like a Brazilian favela or a poor neighborhood where crime is rampant in Caracas in Venezuela. These are issues that really have to be addressed. And so if you pose abolition as the solution, people are going to say, wait a second, that's just scratching the surface. We have to go deep. The other reform, right, that has been proposed is not outright or abolition altogether, but defunding the police. And by this, we mean reallocating, right, revenue from bloated police departments, right, to go into social programs, to go into community-based institutions that can start to address these underlying problems of joblessness, problems of homelessness, problems of lack of adequate health care, etc. Now, I think this is a mixed bag. Obviously, the impulse, right, as I said earlier, to pry open these budgets and allow people, neighborhoods, people that are most affected to actually have a voice, to participate in the deliberation and in terms of where these resources are going, I think it's a great thing. And ultimately it will push us, right, to budgetary solutions that are much more generous to poor and working people, right? And much more demanding of wealthy people through higher taxation. But if we only defund, right, within the narrow confines, within the narrow fiscal confines as they stand today, in other words, if we just redistribute from existing police budgets into other programs, I'm afraid it will lead to many of the same problems that abolition will lead to. Why? Because of what I said earlier. These police budgets, though they are bloated, they don't contain nearly the enough revenue that's necessary, right, to start producing more egalitarian, more humane society. So if you look at a city like New York City, right, there's been a lot of talk about reallocating $1 billion from the $6 billion police budget. Now, it seems like an enormous amount, and it is. However, it doesn't even begin to scratch the surface. The school budget in New York City, I think, is $25 billion, right? Now, the big risk is that in a context of austerity, where all budgets are shrinking, if you're just taking $1 billion, again, as big as that amount sounds, from policing and spreading it through into other programs and institutions that are already being cut back, right? It might end up even exacerbating the problem, right?
There's also the possibility that the police will push back by withdrawing their protection of lower income neighborhoods and say, well, we'll focus on Park Avenue.
Absolutely.
Rather than the Bronx.
Absolutely. Now, of course, this is not an argument for bolstering police departments and making them stronger and more aggressive, right? But you point to a very real danger that as police budgets shrink in the absence, of course, this is the key, in the absence of a mass increase in revenue for social spending, right? It might actually exacerbate the inequalities. And one way it will do so is one way in which it might do so is what you just described. In fact, there already are indications that the New York City Police Department, for instance, and others throughout the country are doing this, right? As they're coming under scrutiny, right? They're actually scaling back their behavior. Now, in one sense, to the extent that that might reduce police murder, police violence, right, police brutality, it might be a good thing. But on the other hand, because poverty is still an issue, because crime is actually on the rise with this crisis, right? This is the other thing. We have to place this discussion within the broader crisis of COVID and the economic collapse that ensued, right? And so because poverty has been aggravated, because crime has been aggravated, and you can see this in shooting statistics, they've gone way up, right? This just makes poor communities feel even more vulnerable. Now, as you said, poor working communities that had, in the early part of the 20th century had been neglected, right, by city governments and police departments, right, and were left completely unprotected in pockets of rising crime, they always demanded, right, not more police brutality, obviously, but an equal access to good police protection. And so you're absolutely right. The outcomes of something like that might actually be quite worse. So what might be the solution? Well, in our first conversation, I made a comparison, right, to the civil rights movement. And the comparison I made was about just the scale of mobilizations and the quality of mobilizations, right? I made the point that today's protests were more spontaneous, less organized, right? Much bigger, but less organized. Whereas the civil rights civil rights mobilizations were more coordinated and targeted, even when they didn't reach the magnitude of these. But there's something else I think we can take from the civil rights movement, right? When we're thinking about solutions to this problem, we can once again look back and seek guidance, right? From really the mainstream, not even the leftmost sectors of the civil rights movement. If you look at what key figures, including Martin Luther King, but other very important organizers, right, and coordinators of the movement, like Bayard Rustin, who, by the way, is someone we should all rediscover. Everyone should read the essays he wrote, all socialists at least, in the mid-60s, right? They're just brilliant. Someone like Philip Randolph, who was a trade unionist and was really not only leader of Black labor, key leader of the labor movement in general at the time. Well, one of the points they made throughout the civil rights movement was that winning desegregation. Yeah, it's very clear that there were twin demands, as it were. One for political and civil rights, right? Political equality, civil equality, right? An end to official de jure racism in institutions. But the other one was for economic equality and economic democracy, because they understood very well that without giving African Americans who had freed themselves, right, through hard work, through mobilization of the injustices and the brutality of Jim Crow, if you didn't then give them employment opportunities, right, if you didn't give them resources for equal education, for dignified housing, right, the victories would prove somewhat hollow. Not altogether, right, but there would be a certain hollowness to the victories. So what did they demand instead? Or I shouldn't say instead, in addition to voting rights and civil rights, right? They demanded economic rights, but they understood full well that economic protections and economic democracy, right, of the type that would be needed for full equality, full emancipation, and full democracy would only work if they were universal protections, universal economic rights. In other words, rights that covered all working people, of course, African American, but beyond, all poor and working people. They felt that it was the only way that you could actually give substance to the victories of the civil rights movement. You had to provide blanket, class-wide, universalistic economic and social reforms. And I think we should look back at that.
People forget that Dr. King was in Memphis fighting for a living wage for sanitation workers.
That's right. And that's in 1968, the year he's assassinated, right? They had been making this point from the early 60s. Of course, sometimes it wasn't the most prominent because they were focused on winning civil rights and voting rights, but they had constantly made this point. But again, the key is that they didn't say, right, we should target poor Black communities for resources, for narrow reforms, or for eliminating racist behaviors and practices, right? It wasn't a targeted approach, it was a universal approach, right? Because they understood that the only way you could push these really deep reforms forward, right, was to have a class-wide movement. And again, this is not to downplay the disparities that African Americans faced. It was just a more realistic look at how to come upon a solution. And that solution was one that was based in a multiracial, working class set of organizations and demands.
So we're almost out of time, but I think you've taken us to an interesting place where you're placing the problem of police as a specific in terms of a larger society that's rotten at the core and needs to be addressed globally.
That's right. In this climate in particular, you know, we're living really dangerous times, right? Where the economic crisis and the austerity that's about to hit with even more intensity, right, will, I fear, right, allow right-wing demagogues, right, to whip up racialized animosities, right, and even racism, right? And as progressives, as radicals, right, we have to do our best to preempt that, to make sure that doesn't happen. And this is another reason to seriously consider universalistic demands rather than narrower, more focused demands on the symptomatic nature of these awful crises that American society is going through right now.
Okay, well, thank you. You've raised a lot of things to think about. I've been talking to René Rojas, sociology professor at Binghamton University, about issues relating to policing and how they tie into the broader issues that face our society. This has been DSA Presents. Thanks for watching.
1, 2, 1, 2, 3.